Hey everyone, this is Joel Patterson. This is my case study for EDL 851. A good teacher turns bad. Stress at home causes problems at school. So here we go. Okay, just leading off a quick summary of our case of a good teacher turns bad. This case takes place at a school called Crestview Elementary. It's a rural community, very consistent school. The staff has not really turned over much in 8 years. The first grade principal, or the first grade teacher rather, Mrs. Horton, is a former teacher of the year, a very accomplished teacher who's kind of gotten into some rough times of late. And Mrs. Wilson is the principal. It's her third year in that role. Prior to being a principal, though, she was a classroom teacher for, I believe it was about 14 years or so. So also experienced in the school setting. Some issues are starting to pop up with Mrs. Horton's class, and so that's led to a conference that's been set up with Mrs. Horton, Mrs. Wilson, and Mr. Stafford, who's requesting that his daughter is moved from the class because of some verbal abuse and just issues popping up in Mrs. Horton's class. And then in that meeting, conflict ensues, and everyone leaves pretty well upset. So starting off category 1, our problem identification and analysis. Like I said, Mrs. Horton is a very accomplished teacher. She's done some great things for Crestview. The staff at Crestview is very proud of the things they've accomplished, and having very little turnover with staff, having that consistency. Mrs. Wilson is an experienced educator and administrator. She is kind of new, 3 years in the principal role, so she's trying to not rock the boat too much, but she's going to have to deal with this problem for sure. So she notices a change in Mrs. Horton, her disposition. She's just kind of changed as a person, and kind of through connecting the dots with other staff, they've found out that her Mrs. Horton's husband has left, and so she's kind of left to raise her 2 kids on her own. So she's a little stressed out in her home life, which is kind of derailing what's going on at school. The conference is set up with Mr. Stafford, and basically ends in Mrs. Horton yelling at Mr. Stafford and really no problem being solved. Go back here. So what do we need to know? What triggers these issues for Mrs. Horton? We know that with her husband leaving and the stress of raising her kids on her own, that those are probable causes for some of this, but we just need to dig a little deeper and find out if there's anything else that's happening that we could possibly support. What are the other ways that we can support Mrs. Horton? Are there different groups that we can provide her access to, either at school or outside of school? Other supports we could give her in the classroom. Documentation, I think with the complaints that are rolling in, that needs to all be documented, whether it's on a phone call or an email, or just jotting down some notes so that if you do end up having to go down that road of due process with Mrs. Horton, you've got some documentation there. Another thing we need to know is why are parent-teacher conferences not being held? That should be a non-negotiable, that all teachers are doing those. What efforts can we go through to rebuild trust with the students in Mrs. Horton's class, with the parents in that class, and just other staff that she's kind of burned bridges with? So we need to start rebuilding that. And then would moving students create new problems? I know a lot of classes are structured in a way because of support that's in those classes. So if we start moving students around, is that going to affect the support that those classes have? Okay, so our problems, I kind of narrowed it down to 3 areas. Number 1, Mrs. Horton's disposition. Is there anything that we can do to lessen the load? She is stressed out, and it's showing up in school. Her home life is kind of derailing everything that's going on at school, going from a teacher of the year type teacher to, berating the students and having parents wanting their kids to be pulled from the class. Is she aware of this unraveling? She may not even be aware that she's changed this much. So definitely need to be solving that problem. The next one is, do we move Stafford or not? The student, Mr. Stafford, that we're meeting with him about. If you do, we could create a domino effect, and then every single student who has a complaint, they are going to want to be moved from the class as well. And so I'll skip to my 3rd bullet point there, just setting a precedence. If we move Stafford, then at any time this year, next year, or down the road, if someone has an issue with the teacher, they're going to think that if you complain that you can get out of the class. So I think we need to try to work through the problem before moving any students. And then para support. If we move students out of this class, is that going to affect para support for Mrs. Horton's classroom? Mending relationships with Horton. Like I'd said in the previous slide, she has kind of burned some bridges with staff, definitely with the families in her room, and then the students themselves are not enjoying being in that classroom. So category 2, proposed plan of action with appropriate strategies for implementation. First off, following up with the families that have complained, and even the ones who haven't, to address the concerns, let them know that we are working through the issues and trying to solve them. Then I would conference with Miss Horton, and I would just lay it all out to her, tell her, here's where you were, here's our observations that we had in several years in the past, and how well you'd been doing, and here's where we're at now, what's going on, try to figure out how we can help her. And then I said implement some improvement plan for Mrs. Horton, which would include increased observations, walkthroughs, and then also support in her room, some extra para support. Documenting the progress or lack thereof. That way, if we do end up going down the road of due process with her, we have that information. Scheduling parent-teacher conferences with all the families, getting that communication going back again with families and letting them know how their students are doing in class and trying to rebuild that. And then the last one, staff professional development on self-care. And then for students, implementing some SEL, social emotional learning curriculum to kind of help with some of the strategies to deal with stressors like this. And then on the staff side of things, just providing some extra measures for staff to ensure that they are taking care of themselves as best as they can so they can be their best at school. Okay, category 3, by resolving this issue, we are promoting the academic success and personal well-being of every student. I said on this slide, by increasing supports and then observations, we're enhancing those instructional practices. The students will have a better ratio working with the para or the teacher in the classroom. The observations will give us time to observe Mrs. Horton's practices and try to give her some feedback to improve her strategies and instructional methods. Bridging that school and home divide. It's completely eroded at this point, but by doing parent-teacher conferences and just increasing communication, we can begin to mend that, which is going to help. And then supports for staff is going to increase relationships with students. So making sure our staff are taking care of themselves first is going to put them in a better spot when they're at school to help the students. So what was I thinking, feeling, and valuing? Thinking, I said, why were we not more proactive? These issues with Miss Horton's disposition have been happening for a while, so why weren't we jumping in to help her out when she needed support a year ago or 2 years ago? So kind of how did we get to this point? How did we let it snowball to this point? Parent-teacher conferences should be non-negotiable. School-wide, everyone should be doing those. What was I feeling? Concern for the well-being of Horton. It's obvious she is overloaded with stress, and we have not supported her. So I think the school's kind of failed there. Upset that supports weren't provided. I think if you see those issues, then they need to be addressed, especially since she's a member of the staff team. And then just disappointed in the environment of the students. Letting it get to a point where all these students are wanting to get out of your class. You can only imagine how that's affecting them where they don't even want to be at school. So what was I valuing? I said vocal parents that can advocate for their kids. If they know something is going wrong, that they can speak up and ask for some change. Thorough supportive observation methods. So having those pre-conferences or pre-observation conferences with teachers, giving them feedback so that they can actually improve as educators. And then having a collaborative culture that supports all students and staff. So with the issues with Mrs. Horton, if there was a collaborative culture in this building where they were working together, maybe we could have kept her from falling down as deep as she has. All right. debriefing the problem, any unresolved open issues or any that need further investigation. I said ongoing steps to repair the relationships. Obviously, parent-teacher conferences alone will not be enough. So what other methods will we do to bridge that gap from school and home? The implementation date of this self-care for professional development and the SEL curriculum, when would we be able to start those? Will Horton be open to change? That's a big one. If we're going to provide her these extra supports, she has to be willing to take a step forward also. And if she's not, then would we proceed with moving students? If she's not making any changes, then we're probably going to need to move those students from her class. Is our improvement plan working? If it is, that's great. If it's not, then we've documented the steps, and we may need to move down to the due process with her at the end of the year to remove her as a teacher. Okay, how did you, the educational leader, promote the academic success of every student? Increased observations and support for Horton's class. That would increase the ratios for student to teacher. The parent-teacher conferences would provide us another avenue for communicating with all families in the classroom about where their students are at. And then just addressing issues and rebuilding relationships with students, with staff, and with families as well. On the personal well-being, I said the implementation of the SEL curriculum, staff professional development of self-care strategies, and increasing the observations to assess the culture that's going on in Ms. Horton's classroom and really all of the classrooms in the building, and then being able to provide feedback and actually grow our teachers and enhance them instead of just not addressing issues that need fixed. So how did you, the school leader, enhance instructional capacity? Provided feedback from the observations, from walkthroughs. We've documented progress on the improvement plan, and then we've collaborated together to reflect on those, whether it's me and Ms. Horton or myself and the grade level. Collaboration is going on so we can try to enhance our instructional capacity there. Professional development would be geared towards staff wellness, taking care of ourselves so that we can take care of others next. And that is it. So thank you guys for watching. I've learned a lot this semester, and good luck to everyone out there.